Welcome to Project Catalyst, an economic development podcast. I'm Tina Emerson, Chief Marketing Officer at Maynard Nexon, here with our Economic Development Practice Group Leader, Tushar. Good to see you again, Tushar.
It's nice to see you, Tina.
Well, back again, we have a return guest to talk to us about the critical role that the rail system plays in economic development projects. Brian Gwin is an industrial development manager for Norfolk Southern. He also serves as chairman of the board for the Southern Economic Development Council, the oldest and largest regional economic development association in North America, with members in 17 states in the American South. Thanks for being with us again, Brian. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Well, let's get into it. We all know who Norfolk Southern is. We see you all the time. We see you everywhere. Tell us more about the company and the areas that you cover.
Sure. So Norfolk Southern is a Class 1 railroad. We are one of about 6 Class 1 railroads in North America. Our rail system covers about 20,000 miles in 21 different states. Essentially, we are east of the Mississippi, except for we do have a line to Kansas City. And our rail lines cover every state in the east. We serve every major deep water port on the East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. We interchange with 2 of our large Western partners, the Union Pacific and the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, the BNSF. And then, of course, there's CSX, and our network kind of overlay each other on the eastern half of the United States. And then you have the Canadian railroads and the Mexican railroads. So the rail system is actually a North American system. It's completely interconnected between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And so Norfolk Southern is engaged in economic development. We have been engaged in economic development really since the founding of the railroad. The railroad kind of, in a way, started economic development. Many of our towns and cities were founded because the railroad was there. And so I lead economic development for the state of South Carolina for Norfolk Southern, and I'm fortunate enough, as you mentioned, to be the chairman of SEDC. So thank you for having me here today.
Yeah, thanks for being with us, Brian. I know we've been friends for a long time, and we've worked in the same space for a long time, and I certainly know your journey to your position, but I always love to hear it, and I'm sure others that might be listening or watching now don't know your journey to your position, because many of us in economic development, in whatever capacity, didn't start out down that path. So at the risk of being embarrassingly on the nose with the question I'm about to ask you, what was the track that you laid to you like that? To end up in the position that you are now with Norfolk Southern?
Well, actually, it's unique. We have a new hire up in North Carolina, Mary Lisa Pegg, used to work for EDP&C, and she's a huge fan of rail puns. So big shout out to Mary Lisa. So my start in the rail industry, I started right out of college. I grew up in South Carolina. I grew up in Walterboro, South Carolina, went to Clemson University. And Norfolk Southern hired me right out of school. I was a marketing major and went to work in our marketing department and ran a big part of our automotive team for a long time. I was located in Roanoke, Virginia, and then I worked inside of a General Motors assembly plant up in Moraine, Ohio, which is outside of Dayton. I lived in Detroit for about a year and a half managing outbound vehicle shipments for the Ford Motor Company and worked a lot in the automotive sector. Then I moved again to Norfolk, Virginia. I managed contracts and pricing for Norfolk Southern in our automotive group for about 3.5 years while I got my MBA at William & Mary, and then moved to Atlanta and took on a different role in Norfolk Southern. We used to have a group called Modal Logistics, and basically I was a supply chain management consultant to our customers. So I was hired out to our customers to help them design their supply chains and help them really use rail in their supply chains, and what I became a real expert at. And so through that, I was introduced to a number of site selection consultants who were working large projects at the time that had large logistics and supply chain requirements. And they wanted to help their clients understand the projected costs of their logistics network for specific sites. And so I was hired by those consultants to work with them on doing supply chain analysis for sites, individual sites, because basically your site determines your transportation costs to a large extent. We like to say when you put a pin on the map, it determines 80% of your transportation expenses right away. Like you don't get to move that at a certain point. So it's very important to get that right on the front end. So that was my first introduction to economic development. And it was funny because I was doing that, and my mentor, well, he became my mentor, a guy named Newell Baker. He's since retired at Norfolk Southern. But he found out I was from South Carolina, and I was working in this economic development world, and he goes, "You want to be our industrial development manager for Norfolk Southern in South Carolina?" And I said, "What's that entail?" And he tells me, and I was like, "So I get to live in South Carolina and work for Norfolk Southern?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Sounds great to me." So I came over here in 2006. I don't think I expected to still be here today, but I found economic development incredibly stimulating and so unique in that I'm a very project-oriented person, and the projects are constantly coming. They're constantly different. They're always changing. It's a dynamic environment. I'm very independent in the sense I'm a self-starter, and I get to run my own organization over here, my own territory, if you will. And it's just been a fabulous career to have in economic development, and to have the support of a large company like Norfolk Southern behind me has been critical.
And the rail is really moving so much of the economy, and that's really something that you can get excited about in your career. And so much of what we use every day comes from Norfolk Southern rails. I mean, probably a lot of things that we don't even realize. Mm-hmm. Tell us about some of the industries that you serve.
Sure, absolutely. So we're kind of set up into different, what we would call commodity groups and certain groups. So, kind of going back to the roots of the railroad, a lot of it started by moving coal. So a lot of the electricity that you have today is powered by coal. So the power that is maybe running this microphone or the lights in this room might be from burning coal. Now that business is starting to decline, and it's in a bit of a cyclical more of a systemic decline. But it's still around. It's not quite what it used to be. And then we also still export a lot of coal for steel making. So there's a huge amount of steel making needed around the world that uses metallurgical coal. So a lot of that is moved by rail. And then we have a metals and construction group, and it's basically what you might think of. We serve steel mills and scrap mills and rebar mills and all kinds of pipe mills to move steel around the United States. We move inbound iron ore to the steel mills, and then we'll move the outbound steel from the plant. And we move that steel to various companies all over the United States. And then our construction materials group moves brick and sand and aggregate. In South Carolina, a lot of people don't know this, but one of the biggest things we move in South Carolina is aggregate, is rock. Charleston's a wonderful city, and it's growing like a weed, but there's nothing underneath it other than pluff mud. You have to have rock to build asphalt and concrete, and all of that comes actually from Columbia, and it's moved into Charleston by rail. So those are our construction markets, lumber, things like that. Then our agricultural markets. We serve farmers throughout the United States. We are a vital component of the supply chain for feed that feeds chickens and hogs and animals throughout the Southeast to connect them with the Midwest and the corn that's grown out there. We move wheat and we move ethanol. We move a lot of ethanol out of the Midwest to blending stations around the South. And in the East, we move crude oil, believe it or not. There's crude by rail that moves out of the Bakken Formation up in the Dakotas that goes into the East. We move a wide variety of agricultural products like sweeteners, and then we move wine. We move, for the Gallo Company up in Chester, we actually move wine by rail. We move beer. All the Corona beer that comes into the United States, believe it or not, comes in on boxcars out of Mexico. So there's a wide variety of things that go into that agriculture and consumer products world. We do automotive. About 60 to 70% of every finished vehicle in this country moves by rail before it gets to the dealer. So every major assembly plant is served by rail. We ship a lot of the inbound parts into the plants by rail. And then our chemicals franchise is very diverse. We move all kinds of chemicals from, and we throw plastics into that. So plastics are a form of a chemical that moves and a wide variety of chemicals from chlorine to anhydrous ammonia to things that I can't even, quite frankly, pronounce, are moved by the railroad. So those are some of our, and then our largest growing segment is intermodal. So intermodal is the shipment of containers, shipping containers, via more than one mode, meaning that the container can move from being on a rail car to being on a truck to being on a ship. So the shipping container was just invented in 1956. So it is a relatively recent development in shipping. Prior to that time, everything moved in break bulk, and it was unloaded at the ports by fork trucks and things like that. And then a guy named Malcolm McLean, who not even a lot of people know who that name is, but he invented the shipping container. And you could argue that it might have actually been one of the most important inventions of the 20th century, because it enabled global commerce and it enabled global trade, and it enabled countries from throughout the world to trade and to move products and to keep prices low. So intermodal is a growing part of what we do. It has two components. There's an international side, so that's where we work with the ports to move those 40-foot and 20-foot containers inland from the ports. We also move exports, so we move them from major centers of commerce like Chicago and Atlanta and inland places to the port for export. And then we have a massive domestic intermodal network where we move products for trucking companies and also large shipping companies like FedEx and UPS. A lot of your packages that you ship on UPS or FedEx actually move on the rail line. And they're UPS is one of our largest customers along with FedEx. So J.B. Hunt is also a large customer of Norfolk Southern and the Hub Group. These are all companies that ship truckload quantities, but we have a driver shortage in this country, and it's also more cost effective and it's more environmentally friendly to use the rails to move a lot of this product over the longer hauls. So they're large customers of Norfolk Southern as well. So we move a lot of things that you use every single day and probably don't know it.
Yeah, and if we can dig a little bit deeper on something you mentioned and that you referenced in your prior response, the role of rail in landing economic development projects. Can you talk a little bit about that and perhaps maybe how the utility, form, and function of rail involvement in a project has changed? You mentioned intermodal. There are concepts like inland ports that have now started to be developed. It's no longer, while that's still out there, it's no longer the case, right, that projects have to have a sidetrack or a rail spur coming right on site for you all to be involved in their success and growth. And then maybe talk a bit about working with foreign direct investment companies as they are evaluating sites and maybe what their notions are on the importance of rail for their projects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I'll start with the last one first because I think it's important. We work with a lot of foreign companies, and the way that the rail system is used in the United States is very different than overseas. We've primarily used our rail system in the U.S. to move freight. It's primarily used overseas to move passengers. We are also a not government-owned system. So we are publicly traded corporation. We own, maintain, and operate our own rail lines. So that is very different than the models that are overseas. And so we oftentimes have to explain that to foreign companies that were coming over here to do business. They also, when they hear rail, many times they think of containers. So we've had several projects. One of your clients, actually, we were working on a project with, and they said, we need to move a large amount of rail cars, and we were kind of confused at first because they thought we needed rail on the site, and come to find out actually they were talking about containers, and they were going to be a wonderful intermodal customer, but they actually didn't need rail on the site. And I want to help customers put rail on their site as many times as I can. However, if they don't need it, I'd rather put them on a non-rail site, because if you don't need it, then rail can be, and I mean this because I love it, a very restrictive element to introduce into a site selection, because there aren't as many sites out there as you think that actually have rail and that have really good rail access. So you want to use your rail served sites for rail users. And so oftentimes I'm working with companies to find out what their needs are from a supply chain standpoint to help explain to them why they may need rail or why they don't need rail. Some companies think they don't need rail and they actually find out that they do. A lot of the new battery companies that are coming out, some of them when they first came out said, oh, we don't need rail. And now they're finding out that the weight of the batteries and the fact that they're actually considered hazardous materials in the United States makes it a lot easier to move them by rail. But when they built their first plant, they said, oh, we don't need rail. And so now they're on a non-rail site, and you're kind of stuck at that point. So it works both ways. So we always encourage the allies we work with, the companies, bring us in and talk to us about what you're doing. We can help you understand, is rail something you need in the site? Is it not? If it's not, then maybe does intermodal more what you need, or possibly a transload solution? There are always ways to take advantage of the rail system, the economics of rail, and the sustainability advantages of rail without necessarily having rail on your site.
And what are some of the challenges that come with including rail in a project?
A lot of it comes down to geometry. A lot of it comes down to it is a very restrictive element to introduce into a site. So if you talk to engineers and you look at things, I wish I had one of my graphs here I could show you, but to take a vehicle and to turn it 180 degrees, you can do it probably in about 20 or 30 feet. A truck can turn around in about 75 to 100 feet. It takes almost a full city block to turn a train around. So when you come into a site and you just go, oh, well, we'll just do this. And I'm like, wait, hold on. You can't go more than like a 10-degree curve. So there's restrictions on curves. There's restrictions on grade. And so when you're looking at developing a site, how you bring the rail in, if it's a rail served site, it sounds selfish to say this, but it almost needs to be one of the first things you lay in, because it sometimes will dictate how you do everything else. And so it's critical for us to be involved from a site design standpoint, so that we can help introduce them to how they're going to bring the rail to the site, and then how they're going to integrate the rail into the property and to the building that they're going to build. But it's also critical economically. Railroads offer a lot of economic benefits. From a freight standpoint, we're generally a lot cheaper than moving over the road truck. And then we are significantly better from a sustainability standpoint. A lot of people don't know this, but you can essentially move about 450 trucks on one train. So with 2 drivers on the train, you can move a lot of freight in a much more sustainable way. So we have a very strong Chief Sustainability Officer at Norfolk Southern. We spend a lot of time with our companies and our customers using our carbon calculator. We have a carbon calculator on our website where you can put in all your freight and you can figure out what your carbon emissions are for a specific lane, and then what it would be if you used intermodal, and then what would it be if you used direct rail. And I can say from a recent project I worked on with a company. They were evaluating site locations where they were going to put the plant, and they wanted to understand their rate, their shipping rate, and they wanted to understand transit time. Those have always been the things we wanted, but then they wanted to know the carbon impact of each one, and they were putting a cost of carbon. In their case, they were putting $55 a ton for every ton of carbon impact, because that is their scope 2 emissions. And for especially European companies, but it's even becoming more and more popular with American companies, it's a real cost that they're putting on their own supply chain. So it's now become this third element to how we work with customers to help them understand the implications of where they locate and how they locate their facility, and what not only is their transportation cost expectations going to be, but what is their supply chain going to look like from a carbon impact standpoint.
So Brian, you like me, when you're in economic development, you certainly focus in the geographic area where you live, but also in far broader geography than that. And you and I both focus heavily on the southeastern United States, the American South, as SCDC would call it, and as many of us call it as a result of that. What development of sites is of critical importance right now in the economic development trajectory of the southeastern United States? What are you seeing in states outside of the state in which you live, outside of South Carolina, that other states are doing to invest in sites, to backfill a pipeline, to allow for future development?
Well, I think it's critical, and I think that the South, first of all, has been a victim of its own success. We have had a string of economic victories throughout the South that has taken a lot of great sites. And these are great projects, and they're bringing a lot of jobs and investment to communities. But it's critical that we stay ahead of the curve when it comes to sites. It can take anywhere from a year to 3 years or 4 years to get a site ready for a company before they even come. So the work that's being done today, we may not bear fruit on for at least 2 or 3 years from a site development standpoint. So certainly, as rail sites have been going down, we play an active role in working with communities, private developers, landowners, and states to make sure that there's product available for that effort. And different states take very different approaches. We have seen, as you mentioned, in the last few years, some states put forward significant sums of money, just lump sums of money into sites. Virginia has put an enormous amount of money into sites. Indiana and Ohio have. And then there has been some very creative approaches. The North Carolina Railroad, which is a state-owned railroad in the state of North Carolina, has an enormous amount of investment to do in sites that have rail capability in the state of North Carolina. And they've been able to invest in and bring additional sites to market up there very effectively. The state of Alabama has a very creative tax program called the Growing Alabama Tax Credit that Norfolk Southern has been able to take advantage of to invest in sites in the state of Alabama. And other companies have too. I believe CSX has, and even other companies that are not in the freight industry have been able to take advantage of that tax credit program to direct up to 50% of their own state tax liability towards specific projects in the state of Alabama. So it's a very creative program, something we'd love to see implemented across the South, to be honest with you. But I think that states that are investing in themselves and investing in sites and coming up with creative programs are going to bear fruit over the next 2 or 3 years. And those that are not might find it a little bit harder to find locations to put industries and projects over the next few years.
So I guess what you're saying, to call out your colleague Mary Lisa Pegg again, is these states need to lay the track in order to attract additional economic development projects in the future.
And they need to gather steam towards that effort.
Oh, boy.
Excellent.
Okay, I think it's time to end on the dad jokes. Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Brian, thanks for being here to teach us about all things rail. There's always more to learn under the surface, so we appreciate your time. I would make another pun, but I think you have worn them out. Thank you both very much. We'll see you next time on Project Catalyst. Project Catalyst, an economic development podcast, is a Maynard Nexon and NP Strategy production. To learn more about the podcast and subscribe, visit thecatalystpod.com or find us on your favorite podcast platform.